The official biggest midterm takeaway for this improbably ahistoric, statistically unprecedented result of a Republican loss of governor seats, a likely loss of a Senate seat, and just barely scraping together the slimmest House majority is that this is nothing more than a decisive voter rebuke of election denial, even though nobody listed our democracy or election denial in their exit polling, much to the CNN panel's shock.
And you know what's missing from this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 top 5 issues? Democracy.
Oh, yeah.
It's not even in here. It's not to say that it's not an issue for people, but it doesn't even come close.
Suddenly, everybody became extremely motivated to disregard their wallet as the historical motivator that it is. That despite Republican popular vote numbers completely aligned with historical trends, it didn't translate to the House gains those trends otherwise carry. That despite voter distaste and even outright anger for the direction of the country and a historically unpopular sitting president, voter priority suddenly became punishing anybody who has any questions about the prior election. And funny, these spontaneously motivated voters, completely uncaptured in any polling on election day or prior, were especially motivated in exactly the places where the questions arose last time and exactly the places with the slimmest wins of the largest consequences. What a coincidence indeed. See, it's only when you stop asking questions about any of that that you'll ever have any hope of winning another election ever again. Awfully convenient that's so perfectly aligned with historically unprecedented Democrat performance, but that is the lesson to be learned. Shut up and take it, try harder next time, and maybe you'll get some scraps. And to be clear and unsarcastic for a moment, this is not me alleging fraud. This is me acknowledging the bigger variable here. When you change the way we conduct elections, when we use historically unprecedented methods, we get historically unprecedented results. I don't think we're dealing with some election denial reckoning, at least not primarily. I do think we're dealing with the fact that Democrats have a much better operation to hustle ballots under new systems of remote voting, while Republicans are still playing the old game, now convincing themselves that just a little more rule following will surely help them perform better next time. It's not election denial to acknowledge that when the rules are changed, the game ends differently. It's not tinfoil hattery. It's not conspiracy theorizing. It's just the truth that when we make it 4 strikes and you're out instead of 3, the baseball game is fundamentally changed and the score will be different at the end. But I suppose maybe I shouldn't actually hesitate to embrace the full tinfoil. After all, if any careful and good faith questions will be labeled election denialism anyway, well, then I guess I should go all in and accept the title, because they're going to award it to me regardless. And besides, the way the trends are heading, the conspiracy theory is often the wiser choice anyhow. If I had $100 to place on either the conspiracy theory coming true or the official narrative holding, at this point, I think we all know what the wise bet is. Case in point, there are now shades of that emerging in the ultimate election denial, January 6th. That's why you can't deny elections. After all, it leads straight to the attack that was actually worse than 9/11, according to the FBI agents who had absolutely nothing to do with it.
When you look at something that is an attack on democracy, something that could actually bring about a fundamental change to American governance as we understand it, 9/11 is nothing compared to January 6th.
Just like this election cycle was an organic uprising of voters enraged by election denialism, January 6th was an organic uprising of election-denying terrorists, and it was an unfounded conspiracy theory to suggest that the FBI had any role in it. The fact-checkers repeatedly confirmed, either passively as simple observers, or perhaps actively with the same entrapment methods the Bureau had used in Michigan in the months prior, under the leadership of the very same guy who oversaw investigation into both events. And you might have been fact-checked on social media for making such irresponsible speculation, or perhaps even punished, but it turns out that sort of claim is much less outrageous in federal court when all the facts of the case are actually on display, or at least the unredacted ones. Of course, one step better would be for us to see the evidence behind the facts of the case for ourselves, But for now, we'll have to rely on a New York Times characterization of it instead. Take that for what it's worth, but this development does fit the trend. 5 Proud Boy members are headed to trial for seditious conspiracy charges starting December 12th. And as part of pretrial hearings, court filings indicate that the FBI had as many as 8 informants inside the Proud Boys group in the months before January 6th. The defense team says that some of the information these informants provided to the government is favorable, if not outright exonerating, for these Proud Boy defendants, who of course are accused not just of trespassing or even violent attack, but of a pre-planned agreement to use force to stop the lawful transfer of power. So they were going to use force to stop the feds, but they didn't even have enough force to keep the feds out of their own clubhouse. And the numbers are worth considering here. Up to 8 feds were spying and reporting on these Proud Boys, and only 5 were actually charged. Consider the fact that Enrique Tarrio, the Proud Boy leader who's charged in this case, was himself an FBI informant in other contexts. And we are at a nearly 2-to-1 Fed to criminal suspect ratio in this case. There aren't even enough Spider-Men in the meme to point at all the feds. This one replying to the New York Times story is actually numerically insufficient. What exactly these communications and other records show is publicly unknown. Prosecutors heavily redacted them in court. In fact, even the page numbers were redacted in 500 plus pages of material. But the Proud Boy defendants are now moving to have the case dismissed for Brady violations, as in prosecutors improperly withholding evidence favorable, perhaps even exonerating, to the defense. Now, of course, the obvious question is, which of the 2 possible bad explanations are we dealing with here? Were these FBI informants so bad at their jobs that the feds failed to intervene to stop the seditious conspiracy despite spying on it for months? Or did these feds actually want the sedition to be attempted for reasons political or otherwise? But either way, the FBI's participation in the group is no longer deniable. It is established in court. And just this week, the FBI director, Christopher Wray, refused to deny that participation. It's just participation for what purpose that is the question.
Did the FBI have confidential human sources embedded within the January 6th protesters?
To the extent that there's a suggestion, for example, that the FBI's confidential human sources or FBI employees in some way instigated or orchestrated January 6th, that's categorically false.
Did you have confidential human sources dressed as Trump supporters inside the Capitol on January the 6th prior to the doors being open?
Again, I had to be very careful.
It should be a no. Can you not tell the American people no?
And sure, why assume malice when we could just assume incompetence instead? Maybe they're just horrendously bad at their jobs and not actually corrupt. But the trouble with this charitable interpretation is there's another reason to see some political influence at play: the timing of this case's development. Of course, you'll recall that the pressing danger of ultra-MAGA threats to our democracy was the president's apparently wildly successful closing political pitch, with seditious conspiracists like the Proud Boys as the necessary boogeyman to point to. And remember, the records in this case date back months before January 6th, meaning that the FBI has held on to these records for 2 years. Locked them up tighter than the January 6th defendants themselves, all in preparation to try to get guilty pleas in this case on October 27th, just in time for the freest, fairest election since 2020. And notably, this discovery material, as in these Fed informant records that are apparently useful to the defense, they were not even produced until November 3rd. They wanted this case wrapped up for Election Day without even disclosing all the relevant information to the defense. And of course, that information hasn't just been hidden from the defendants for years. It's been hidden from us, the public, for years. The supposed evidence to prove this was the coordinated terrorist attack that they say it was has just been sitting in federal hands since before January 6th itself, months before, in fact. And while they were just sitting on it, what was originally characterized as a spontaneous event without central organization has somehow morphed into a calculated coup without reference to or the release of that dormant evidence at all. Now, of course, I get that not all evidence is just dumped publicly in a pending court case, but when that evidence is withheld from even the accused themselves, it starts to look a lot more like a cover-up than any sort of honest prosecution. It starts to look like the politics are the aim rather than justice, or certainly the truth. And what's most frustrating, even beyond that apparent misapplication of justice, is that politically, we should all find agreement on this, actually. Even if you do buy that Peter Strzok line that January 6th was in ways worse than 9/11, the question we must answer is why then did the FBI just sit idly by and let it happen despite detailed knowledge of the coming attack beforehand? Because we can drop every political suspicion, and the question remains, if these people can't protect us from terrorist cells in which they are personally participating, what are they going to protect us from ever? What can we expect from them other than the perpetual victimization of the American people? If it is the simple, incompetent inability to stop the threats that they're aware of, a diagnosis of why is in these records they've been sitting on for 2 years. If it is a step further and there is politically nefarious motive, a demonstration of that corruption is in these records they've been sitting on for 2 years. Everybody has something to learn here about what exactly January 6th was and how to stop the next one. And there is a lot of actual unity to be had in that. But of course, instead, the event has been propagandized and weaponized to pit us against each other when we all actually share the same use for the truth in the matter, plus the same gatekeeper withholding that truth from us. If we stop pointing at each other and start pointing at the people who actually know what happened, only then will we finally get some answers. And besides, just sitting around pointing at each other is the Fed thing to do anyway. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Parler. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chatting my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Come on.